knowing that former National Security Advisor John Bolton is alleged to have said President Trump did order him to withhold aid to Ukraine in order to try and leverage a baseless investigation by Ukraine. This means that his former chief of staff was in the room and witnessed behavior by the president that would strongly support a conclusion that that's just the sort of thing President Trump does.
And the Republicans say that that doesn't really matter, that it doesn't reach the level of high crimes or misdemeanors.
Something that's been debated at great length today. In fact, that's one of the most recently discussed questions. I do think the weight of history, of textual evidence, and of all previous impeachments suggest that abuse of power is an appropriate standard for impeachment and removal. Did you have one more question?
Yeah.
I can tell I've got someone behind me. So.
Are you nervous about Collins, Murkowski, Romney, the initial question where they were talking about having mixed motives and whether they can use that as an off-ramp to say, well, maybe we don't need witnesses because maybe Trump had multiple motives for
Okay. If you listen to the answers from both the president's advocates and the House managers, that could be used as an off-ramp. I would suggest more as an excuse. It is clear that in comparable criminal proceedings where there are so-called mixed motives, it's still possible to convict someone on a charge like bribery or extortion, where there's a mixture of corrupt and legitimate motives. So I don't think that actually answers the issue. I don't think that that is a way to say we don't have to consider this. To the last point, I think it is more important than ever that we reach an agreement that allows for witnesses and documents. We've seen more and more recent developments that suggest that in the form of John Bolton, there is someone who was in the room who could give relevant testimony, and where what he has to say is going to come out soon anyway. Let me yield to my colleagues in a second.
Have you any inroads with your Republican colleagues?
I will yield to my colleagues.
Thank you, Coons.
So, Senator, are you going to disagree with that?
Probably. I think what I've noticed, and we're a little into more than a fourth of it now. I think we got it right under 5 hours in. And as it keeps going, I think the focus is on increasingly the foundation of the case itself. And Professor Dershowitz, every time he gets up there, it's an immediate hard comeback because he is attacking this whole process based upon the underpinnings of the articles themselves. And then when he starts talking about the quid pro quo that we did earlier and how that you have to impute motives between a public and a political interest, you can tell that raises the quick response on their side. So I sense that the case in general is starting to weaken on those points and that they keep focusing, and of course, on the question of witnesses.
But
Dershowitz couldn't cite a scholar who agrees with him in the past 100 years. I mean, come on.
Well, if you had listened closely there, he said that there are other scholars, and in his opinion evolved over the last 20 years, but that he is not alone. That was a false statement on the part of Schiff.
That was Dershowitz who said it, Senator.
Can you just...
Yeah, but when Schiff said so, and that was a false...
And he came back and he listed a guy who lived about 100 years ago.
Yes, sir.
Well, the question is, what do you say to the critics who say that the Republicans have abandoned any pretense of being independent jurists and are merely shilling for the president?
Hogwash is what I would say. At the end of the day, I think we are being as objective as either side. Bottom line is, no one walked into the hearing without having heard what was brought before the House. I mean, we've had 192 video clips of witnesses testifying in the House. So we are either having our opinions reinforced or we're rejecting those opinions and asking questions based on the premise brought from the House. The fact that they've brought a flawed, weak case to the Senate, that's on them to make it better. And if they want to make it better, they can do that by calling Mr. Bolton in the House where they have an opportunity. Well, actually what they did was they invited him to speak, but they did not subpoena him.
You're right, they didn't subpoena him. They invited him to speak and he said he wouldn't show up.
He threatened to sue.
Well,
yes,
at the end of the day, they still have the opportunity. He has now said he's happy to come testify. So if you want to hear from Mr. Bolton, all you have to do is hear from him in the House. If you don't mind me finishing the comment, that would be wonderful. if you want to hear from Mr. Bolton, you can do it in the House where they have the ability to hear from him and continue to work on America's priorities. And as we do so, then we would be able to do America's priorities in the Senate as well.
And I would go one step further to say, even if everything in Bolton's book happens to be true and everything he testifies to happens to be true if he happens to be called, I still do not believe that that rises to the level of the impeachable offenses that the House has charged the president with. We've heard 54 questions and answers so far today. At the rate we're going, we're probably going to hear about 160 total, so we're going to have an opportunity for all of our members to hear more information. But I am committed to go to the end of the day on Friday and cast a vote to say I'm ready to go to final judgment. I don't see a need for any additional witnesses. America has heard enough. Most people don't realize that under this system, the Senate can do no other work until we are through with impeachment, which means working on the cost of drugs, working on the highway bill, working on many of the priorities of the American people. So a majority of Americans today are saying this is a waste of time because they know that the president is not going to be removed, and they know that this is an election year, and they say, you have more important things to do actually to advance the country than what we're doing by sitting here in a trial of impeachment.
75% of Americans want to hear from witnesses.
I gave you all the time you wanted. Okay, thank you, everybody. I thought this question period, again, was just so good for our side. So many different instances where our arguments prevailed. Once again, Professor Dershowitz's arguments make just about no sense, that it has to be at the level of bribery or extortion. I think Adam Schiff and the others took them to the cleaners in the argument. And the idea that maladministration is the same as abuse of power, almost no scholar accepts. Second, a very telling moment. They said they don't want absolute immunity, and I asked them the question, name one witness or one document you've allowed the House managers to get when they've requested it, and Mr. Philbin filibustered, P-H-I-L, Mr. Philbin filibustered, because he had no answer. They couldn't name a single witness or a single document. If that's not absolute immunity, I don't know what is. Again, two of the senators who are most interested in, deciding whether to vote for witnesses asked if they could find any instance where the president talked about Biden before he announced for president, and they couldn't answer. They just said, well, I only have the record. That's not true. And then two back and forth. What did Mulvaney mean when he said quid pro quo? What did Bolton mean when he said drug deal? Well, it's back and forth. It looms. You want to know? Ask them, bring them here as witnesses. So I thought that it was a great afternoon for us. I am hopeful we can win the argument for witnesses and documents. We've always said it's uphill. There's tremendous pressure from a vindictive, nasty president on every Republican senator. But I think they sit there as they listen to these questions, and they know the public is totally on our side, and we've got a real shot to get witnesses and documents.
What's your gut tell you? You going to get them?
My gut tells me we're making progress, and I certainly am hopeful.
On that point of witnesses, I saw at one point when Hunter Biden was mentioned by Senator Kennedy, Senator Menendez kind of chuckled, and a few others did as well.
Well, they're always...
Is Hunter Biden still, is that witness for
Hunter Biden has nothing to do with the charges against the president. And it's always they're looking for a diversion. But it's not our call. If they want Hunter Biden, they got 53 votes, they can call him. They don't want him because they know it would make it a circus. I don't think McConnell has the votes on his side for Hunter Biden. No, next.
We've seen time and time again in these, you say that you're hopeful, but we've seen time and time again in these protracted political fights, Leader McConnell win these arguments. What makes
well,
this
you don't win when you stand for a cover-up. You don't win when there's not witnesses and documents and it's not a fair trial. And I think we've got a real shot here, but any conclusion that doesn't allow witnesses and documents is going to make the president's acquittal, if that should happen, worth very, very little, zero. You can't convince the American people it was an acquittal if you don't have witnesses and documents.
You mean exoneration?
Yes.
The senators who were just here before you said the Senate can do no other work as long as you're dealing with this impeachment trial.
Some of the committees met today and passed out bills. They sure can in the morning.
So their argument is, get this
Okay.
over with.
Can I tell you something? It rings so false. We have Mitch McConnell, leader of the legislative graveyard, who hadn't put a single bill on the floor for the year before impeachment, and now they're saying this is getting in their way. Mitch McConnell, we'll meet early in the morning to get some bills on the floor. We dare you. Take 10 of the bills the House passed the day after impeachment ends and put them on the floor. Then talk about that. If they don't do that, they can't talk about getting nothing done. They're the ones who've been expert at getting nothing done. Yes.
Senator Schumer, today during the proceedings outside of the Senate, a member of the Trump administration identified the alleged whistleblower. If someone did that on the floor of the Senate,
Well, I don't think they named a name on the floor of the Senate.
no, I know, but if someone tried that,
You know, this is despicable. This is despicable. This is an administration in their quest for absolute immunity, in their Donald Trump's threats and things towards people like John Bolton, who were once his good friends. They are so afraid of truth, they go to almost any length to stop it from happening in this trial, and sometimes outside the circumstances of this trial.
Senator, what
Let me
do you say
just,
to
I
the
just want to, you asked one. All right, go ahead. You're a
What do you
nice,
say to the
nice guy.
criticism from the GOP, who says that you blew it in the House, that's where it happened, and that they're in
For the
no
GOP
obligation do
to
it here.
blame the House for not having all the witnesses and documents when it was Donald Trump who stopped them and with the snap of his finger can have them all is the ultimate hypocrisy. Thank you, everybody.
Well, I'm absolutely speechless in discovering that I can do anything I want to be reelected, and nothing wrong with it. Not impeachable as long as I'm doing it to be reelected, because that's the definition of public interest. That cannot be the law. And I think that what we've seen is the White House taking such an extreme position, far more overreaching than they need to do. And the other point that I would make is that I think that the 75% of the American people that think we need witnesses and documents has probably risen to 80, maybe 85 after this argument today. The idea that we can finish this trial without John Bolton as a witness is absolutely preposterous. After they characterize his facts as unsourced manuscript or leaks or hearsay, and they complain about lack of evidence, if they want to have anything like a full fair proceeding, we need John Bolton and we need Mick Mulvaney. The idea that what he said was garbled and corrected. Anybody listening to that press conference has to know what he was saying, because he said, get over it. And I really think that this trial has been reduced to an absurdity if there are no witnesses and documents, and there will be more coming out day by day, domino by domino, drip by drip. We're going to see more of the truth emerge, and it will haunt my Republican colleagues.
Senator, would you, talking about the need for Bolton, obviously Republicans can subpoena anyone they want with 51 votes, but would you support some sort of agreement to pair off witnesses?
No, there should be no agreement. I've done quite a few trials. We don't trade witnesses. You get your witness, I get my witness. The key question is a witness relevant? Do they have admissible information? Do they have eyes and ears on something that is germane and relevant to the trial? That's the criterion. That should be it. The Republicans have the power to call anybody they want. They can call 15 witnesses tomorrow if they can get 51 votes. The question should be, will they support witnesses who really have something relevant to say? Nobody could be more relevant and important than John Bolton and Mick Mulvaney, as well as Robert Blair and Mike Duffy. They have eyes and ears on the president.
Senator, earlier today on Twitter, a Trump campaign official identified the alleged whistleblower. If someone tried to do that in the Senate, would you guys have recourse to kind of ask Chief Justice Roberts to step in and penalize that action?
I think a disclosure of the whistleblower's identity would raise legal issues, although on the floor of the Senate there would be some degree of immunity. Certainly under our ethics rules, there would be potential consequences, and I would ask the Chief Justice to immediately intervene and perhaps apply sanctions. It would be unprecedented, but it would be unprecedented for anyone to disclose the identity of a whistleblower on the floor of the Senate. I don't anticipate any of my colleagues will do so.
Senator, have you spoken to any of your Democratic colleagues who remain undecided on the final vote and are maybe considering acquittal?
You know, I'll be absolutely blunt with you. I'm listening. I think the evidence for impeachment is overwhelming. There's more evidence that would corroborate what we've seen and heard so far, but I'm still listening for any evidence that the president will produce showing his innocence. Anything that exonerates him, anything that's exculpatory, I'm hoping he will bring it forth. And he will bring it forth in witnesses or documents. Witnesses that can be cross-examined, documents in black and white that we can see, just like any other trial. So if my colleagues are still listening, that's a good thing. That's our obligation. But I think we are absolutely united on the Democratic side that we do need those witnesses and documents. I know of no colleague who has said, we have enough. All done. We can vote.
Senator, on the Republican side, I noticed a couple of very pointed questions from Senators Romney and Murkowski. Do you think that we're starting to see that some of the Republican senators, especially in the midst of last night's report, are looking for witnesses too?
I think my Republican colleagues are really struggling. I mean, genuinely really struggling, because they see that they are marching off a cliff. They're marching off a cliff led by Donald Trump, and he ain't going to go over that cliff with them. They're the ones who vote. And they know the truth will come out. It's just a question of when. It always does in life, and most especially in Washington, D.C., where there are leaks and books and memos. It all comes out. And it will be probably enough before the next election to have huge consequences for them. So they're going to be haunted by history. If they refuse to see and hear the truth, they cannot complain about what they can't see if they put blinders on. That's what they're doing right now, putting blinders on. And the American people are going to know it before the next election.
On that note, Senator, specifically, Senators Collins and Murkowski raised a question about when the Trump administration started looking into the Biden, specifically trying to set up that timeline. What did you make of that question?
I was confused by the question. I think they're trying to address the issue of, did the president's interest in the Bidens begin just when he announced for president? But I'll tell you, as a former United States attorney and a state attorney general, I'll tell you what one of the most profoundly meaningful facts to come out in this trial so far is for me. The Department of Justice, our chief law enforcement agency, either declined or was never asked to look into the Bidens. All this corruption, all this criminality, supposed illegality, and the Department of Justice was never asked or it declined to look into any violation by Joe Biden or Hunter Biden. Instead, the President of the United States went to a foreign government and asked a foreign leader to investigate a United States citizen. That shocks me.
Is that something you'd be willing to submit as a question to the president's legal team?
Well, we have limited amounts of time. It may well be a question that we submit. Why did it happen in the way? Why did the Department of Justice reject it? I've asked for the documents that reflect the Department of Justice either being consulted or rejecting the request. And if there are no documents, then we need to know that as well. But this is a really important point for the American people to understand. For any citizen to think that the President of the United States is going to go to a foreign government and ask that foreign leader to investigate a U.S. citizen and try to smear them, I think raises profound questions, and I think it's one of the most telling and important facts in this trial so far. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Senator.
I know. My best friend here. It's our buddy.
Yeah. Evening, Senator. How are you?
Good evening. I think we've had a lively afternoon. And I think we've seen yet again that the House manager's case doesn't stand up to scrutiny. In the House of Representatives, the House managers were able to put on a one-sided trial, excluding defense witnesses and only focusing on prosecution witnesses. Here in the Senate, I think there were a number of notable moments in the questioning period. One notable moment is that Adam Schiff, not once but twice, refused to answer if the so-called whistleblower had an actual conflict of interest. The Inspector General told us there was reason to think he had partisan bias in favor of a rival political candidate, but when Adam Schiff was asked whether the so-called whistleblower had an actual conflict of interest and whether he was a fact witness, whether he directly participated in Joe Biden's threatening the government of Ukraine, blocking $1 billion in military aid, and demanding that Ukraine fire the top prosecutor who was investigating Burisma, 2 times, Mr. Schiff refused to answer that question. It was also notable, on most other questions, Mr. Schiff would get up there and riff freely, share his thoughts on a whole host of areas. But when it came to being asked under oath about whether the whistleblower had a clear conflict of interest, was directly involved in Joe Biden's potential corruption, whether the whistleblower himself could have faced potential civil or criminal liability for his direct involvement, Mr. Schiff went utterly silent and refused to answer it. There was a second particularly revealing exchange, which is Mr. Schiff offered a hypothetical. Mr. Schiff said, would Barack Obama have been able to ask Russia to investigate Mitt Romney? And I think one of the more important exchanges was a question that Lindsey Graham and I together asked Adam Schiff and said, okay, let's take your hypothetical that you suggested it. Look, of course, Barack Obama or any president would not be justified in asking for an investigation if there was no basis for the investigation. But that's not what happened here, and so Senator Graham and I suggested making the hypothetical apply to the current circumstances. Specifically, would Obama, if he had evidence that Mitt Romney's son was receiving $1 million a year from a corrupt Russian company, number one, and number two, that Mitt Romney had in his official capacity acted to benefit that corrupt company that was paying his son $1 million a year, would President Obama have had the legal authority to ask for an investigation? Now, the answer to that is obviously yes. Mr. Schiff refused to answer that. He danced and bobbed and weaved and said he wouldn't answer that, but that's the circumstance. And this entire case comes down to one very simple question. Does a president have the authority to investigate corruption when there is credible evidence of corruption? The House managers have tried to lay out a case that there's no basis whatsoever to suspect corruption. Well, we've seen the evidence of Burisma and Hunter Biden and Joe Biden that at very minimum provided a basis to ask, investigate this, and Mr. Schiff refused to engage in that. Yes?
Senator, what is your reaction to Dershowitz's argument that he can effectively just go after a president's political rival, the U.S. interest?
Well, I think that's right. I think Professor Dershowitz, when he presented his argument to the Senate, I think it was a powerful argument, and he went through a litany. He listed, I think it was 40 presidents who've been accused of abuse of power, the standard the House managers are setting out. Those included George Washington, they included John Adams, they included John Quincy Adams, they included Thomas Jefferson, who his political rivals said when he made the Louisiana Purchase that it was an abuse of power. And under the House manager's standard, every one of those presidents could have been impeached. That's not what the framers meant for impeachment to be. I also think it was notable, Professor Dershowitz tonight responded to a question I asked, which is there's been a lot of discussion about was there a quid pro quo, wasn't there a quid pro quo? And the question I asked is, as a matter of law, the legal question before the Senate, does it matter if there was a quid pro quo or not? And isn't it true that quid pro quos are often employed in foreign policy? And Professor Dershowitz rightly pointed out that we engage in quid pro quos all the time. That's not the question. The question is whether the president committed a high crime or misdemeanor, and if he's asking for investigation into possible corruption when there's real and credible evidence that there might be corruption, that is not an impeachable offense. Yes.
What evidence do you have that Vice President Biden used his position to benefit Hunter Biden's position on the board? Because that's what Democrats say, there is no evidence of that.
So,
part of your hypothetical question
absolutely. So we have the best evidence of all, which is Vice President Joe Biden's own words. And we've seen the video, which if your publications have not aired the video, I think it's the most important video in this entire proceeding. It is the video of Joe Biden bragging. And he's proud of this, where he's bragging that he told the president of Ukraine, number one, that he would block $1 billion in foreign aid, American loan guarantees to Ukraine, unless and until he fired the prosecutor who was investigating Burisma. And Joe Biden ends that video. Hold on, let me finish the answer. Joe Biden ends that video with saying, "And son of a bitch, he was fired." Now, Joe Biden is admitting,
but some would
and
say that Biden's actions made it that the corruption was actually looking to more, not less.
That could be, but I'll tell you one institution that didn't say that was the New York Times. The New York Times had reported just weeks earlier that that prosecutor was investigating Burisma. And to be clear, look, the House managers have argued there was zero basis to investigate. When you got a guy being paid $1 million a year, and he doesn't know anything about oil and gas, he doesn't have any apparent involvement in Ukraine, that certainly raises the question of corruption. And Joe Biden was the point person for Ukraine, and when he got the prosecutor fired, that happened because, by the way, you want a quid pro quo, the one admitted quid pro quo is what Joe Biden admitted to on film, and that, at a minimum, provided a reasonable basis to say this ought to be investigated.
Senator, but it wasn't just Joe Biden who wanted the prosecutor fired. It was the UK the EU, the IMF, the World Bank, and a whole bunch of our allies. Are you saying that they were all in on this scheme? And also, can you tell me how many members of ExxonMobil's board have oil and gas experience?
So let's take your question. Look, as far as I know, the UK, the IMF, and other players didn't have a son on the board getting paid $1 million a year. And when it comes to corruption, you know, it is really astonishing to see the House managers talk about cover-up, and at the same time go all in on being desperate to cover up any evidence of Burisma's and Hunter Biden's and Joe Biden's potential corruption. And you know, I saw as I was walking down here that Chuck Schumer, I saw as I was walking down here that Chuck Schumer had said to the press, well, I don't think the Republicans have the votes to call Hunter Biden. That really speaks volumes how desperate Democrats are to block Hunter Biden. Let me tell you, Chuck's wrong on that. I don't know if we will call additional witnesses in addition to the 17 witnesses who already testified in the House proceedings. I don't know on Friday if there will be 51 votes to call yet more witnesses. But I'm confident of this. If there are additional witnesses, if the Democrats get their wish to call John Bolton as the 18th witness in this matter, I am confident we're not going to do the kind of one-sided partisan show that the House did. We're going to be fair to both sides, which means if we call John Bolton, I promise you we're calling Hunter Biden too.
I'm sorry. The New York Times reporter that you mentioned earlier, his name's James Risen. Are you aware that James Risen completely contradicted what you're saying that he said, commenting on this article, that his words have been twisted, the 2015 article?
You know, it's not surprising to see the press engaged in situational ethics, and right now one of the reasons that the American people, I think, have lost trust in a lot of the press is because so many of the press are desperately just repeating whatever the Democratic narrative is. The headline in that New York Times story talked about the vice president, his son, and prosecuting a corrupt Ukrainian company. And the New York Times reported the fact that the prosecutor was investigating Burisma. Now, I get today the media wants to pretend none of that existed, but if you look at Burisma, and by the way, Burisma was a company that was through and through corrupt. If you look at how Burisma was founded, the oligarch that founded Burisma was at the time the sitting energy minister of Ukraine. So he granted gas licenses to his own company and got incredibly rich through corruption. Now, why is that relevant? Because A, everybody knew Burisma was corrupt. This was common knowledge. It was such common knowledge that Chris Hines, the stepson of John Kerry, terminated doing business with Hunter Biden and with Devin Archer, his college roommate, because when they went on the board of Burisma and were taking $1 million apiece, he said it's unacceptable to work for Burisma. John Kerry's son-in-law could tell that, but yet at the same time, Joe Biden was perfectly happy to remain the decision maker on Ukraine policy. That raises real questions of corruption.
All
right, thank you, guys.
Criticism that you all have abandoned independence to be a show for the president.
The answer is one senator, just the chairman and CEO. Apparently they were all in on this. Oh, yeah. Like they were all in on it. I mean,
it's the easiest question to find back on. So I think I bagged because I think I've asked that same one.
It's ridiculous that they consider themselves a personal security guard
chairman and CEO.
elected officials to protect them from question.
How many people on that?
That's not a security issue.
Well, none of this.
I should have worded it. Would you be surprised if I did?
It's a party now, man who's here.
That was interesting.
Yeah, James Risen
And his photos underneath.
I love it. That's the best, well-placed sarcasm.
I should have asked him if his kids have committed any new crimes lately.